When I first set up camp in the Olympic National Forest, I thought I had found the perfect spot. I had hiked most of the day, weaving through old-growth trees so tall and thick that they felt more like walls than trunks. The canopy was heavy with moss and lichen, long green threads hanging down like curtains. Ferns spread wide on the forest floor, and the ground was soft with years of fallen needles. The air smelled rich and damp, almost heavy, and even though the trail I had taken was marked, it felt like I had stepped into a different world. I picked a flat space near a cluster of giant firs, far enough from the trail to be hidden but not so far that I couldn't find my way back. I set my tent, rolled out my bag, and boiled water for a simple meal. Everything felt ordinary, almost peaceful, until I started to really listen. That was when I realized something was strange. At first, I couldn't place it. I was sitting there with my food, sipping from a cup, and something nagged at me. I looked up at the trees, the thick canopy swaying faintly in the afternoon light, and that was when it hit me. There was no sound, no birds calling from the branches, no squirrels rustling in the leaves, no faint buzz of insects. The forest was utterly still. I had camped in quiet places before, but usually there was something. An occasional crow, a distant woodpecker, the scratch of a chipmunk in the brush. Here there was nothing. My own movements seemed too loud, the scrape of my spoon against the cup echoing in my ears. For a moment, it unsettled me. The stillness pressed in as if the whole forest were holding its breath. After a while, though, I told myself it was just different here. Maybe the canopy was so thick that most birds stayed farther out where the light broke through. Maybe the time of day made them quiet. The longer I sat with it, the more I got used to it. The eerie silence that had bothered me at first began to feel almost calming. My thoughts seemed sharper, clearer. I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat. The forest was giving me space, I thought. As the evening wore on, the shadows stretched across the forest floor, but the quiet never broke. I gathered some water from a nearby creek. Barely a trickle, but it was enough, and returned to camp. Even the water seemed muted, flowing softly under the mossy rocks. The world felt padded, insulated, like sound couldn't travel far here. When night came, it was darker than I expected. The canopy blocked most of the sky, and only thin slices of moonlight broke through the branches. I crawled into my tent and tried to settle, but the silence was heavier now. In most places, nighttime brought noise. Frogs croaking, crickets chirping, owls calling. Here there was nothing, just the faint creak of the tent fabric when I shifted, the muffled sound of my bag when I moved. At first, I liked it, felt pure, untouched. But as the hours dragged on, it began to turn on me. Lying there, I realized how exposed I was. In silence that complete, any sound would stand out sharply. My ears strained for something, anything, and when I finally did hear it, my whole body tensed. It was faint, just a snap like a twig breaking under weight. I held my breath, waiting for it again. Nothing. I let the air out slow, telling myself it could have been anything. A branch falling, soil shifting, roots cracking in the ground. But then it came again. Not close, not right against my tent, but close enough that I knew it wasn't random. Something was moving out there. The sound was slow, careful. A step, then silence. Another step, then silence. Whatever it wasn't hurrying. It was deliberate. My chest tightened as I listened, too afraid to move. The silence of the forest made it worse, because the steps weren't masked by anything. They stood out as if they were the only sound in the world. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my light, but the idea of exposing myself made my skin crawl. If it was an animal, the light might spook it, but if it wasn't, then what? I gripped the handle of my knife and stayed still, barely even breathing, listening as the steps shifted, moving slowly around. Minutes dragged. The footsteps came and went, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I tried to count them, to measure how many feet away they might be, but in that dead silence, distance was impossible to judge. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe even an elk. But deer don't usually circle. They don't creep step by step like that. At some point, the sound stopped altogether. The silence returned, thicker than before, like a blanket pressed against my ears. I lay there for what felt like hours, knife still in hand, straining for even the faintest noise, but there was nothing. Eventually, my body gave in, exhaustion pulling me into a shallow, restless sleep. When I woke, pale light filtered through the trees. My first thought was of the silence, and when I listened, it was still there. No morning chorus, no chatter in the branches, just stillness. My tent was damp with condensation, the air inside cold, but I crawled out anyway, scanning the ground around me. First, I saw nothing. Then, a few feet beyond my tent, I noticed it, an impression in the soft soil, faint but clear. Footprint. It wasn't sharp enough to make out detail, but it was larger than my boot and deep enough that it couldn't have been left by a deer. I crouched, staring at it, my throat dry. There was another one a little farther, and another beyond that, fading into the moss. I followed them only a short distance before they disappeared in the thick undergrowth. No sign of what had made them, no clear trail, just a reminder that something had been close, closer than I wanted to think about. The silence, which had felt almost calming the day before, now made me uneasy. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. A forest should have sound. Even in the cold, even under thick canopy, there should be some kind of life making itself known. Here there was nothing, and paired with the footprints, it felt less like nature and more like a warning. I broke camp quickly, packing my gear with shaking hands. The whole time I half expected to hear the steps again, slow and deliberate, moving through the stillness. But there was nothing, just silence that seemed to follow me as I hiked back toward the trail. By the time I reached the trailhead hours later, I finally heard something. A bird, faint and distant, chirping as if the world had come alive again. The sound felt strange after so long without it, almost too sharp in my ears. But it was a relief, a reminder that the forest wasn't dead everywhere. When I looked back into the direction I had come from, the trees loomed still and heavy, their moss-covered branches draped low. The silence back there wasn't just quiet. It was total, absolute, as if the land itself had swallowed sound. I don't know what moved around my camp that night, or why the forest had been so empty of life, but I know this. The silence in the Olympic National Forest wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that warned you, the kind that reminded you you were only a visitor, and not a welcome one. I left with the memory of that stillness pressed deep into me, and I knew I would never camp in that part of the forest again. I had never camped so far north before, and I thought I was ready for it. I had done plenty of cold weather trips, plenty of nights in snow and ice, but the Arctic had a way of making everything feel different. It wasn't just the temperature, although that was biting enough to freeze any bit of exposed skin within minutes. It was the emptiness, the absolute vastness of it. I had set up camp far from any road, far from any settlement, and as I sat in the dim twilight that stretched across midnight, I realized how alone I really was. The thing about the Arctic in summer is that it never gets dark. The sun dips low but doesn't vanish, and instead of night you get this endless bluish glow, as if the land itself is stuck in some half-lit dream. At first, I thought it would be easier than true night. No fumbling with a headlamp, no pitch-black forest pressing in, but after a few hours I realized it was worse. My mind kept expecting darkness, kept waiting for shadows to cover me, but instead everything stayed visible in this strange dull light that stretched and warped the hours. Midnight looked like dusk, and dusk stretched on until I couldn't tell what time it was anymore. I pitched my small tent on a flat patch of tundra near a line of low rocky ridges. The ground was hard, permafrost beneath a thin layer of moss and lichen, and driving the stakes in took far longer than I'd planned. The silence around me was different from any forest silence I'd known. There was no wind through trees, no crackle of animals moving through brush, just the occasional whisper of a breeze sliding across the open land. The ground felt dead, stripped bare by the cold. I remember standing there after finishing the tent, looking out at the horizon, and realizing I couldn't see a single moving thing. No bird, no animal, not even an insect, just stillness. As the hours wore on, that stillness began to press in. My stove hissed faintly as I boiled water, and that tiny sound seemed almost offensive in the silence, as if I was disturbing something that had ruled the land for longer than I could imagine. Eating helped a little, gave me something to focus on, but afterward, when I sat in the tent and listened, every beat of my heart felt loud. I shifted my sleeping bag around me, trying to make myself comfortable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be here. It wasn't fear of animals, exactly. I had brought a bear canister for food, had set it far from camp, had read about polar bears but knew they were rare this far inland. It wasn't about a threat I could name. It was just the sense that the place didn't want me. I thought maybe fatigue was making me jumpy, so I zipped up and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. The pale light kept tricking me into thinking it was still early, that I should stay awake. My body wanted night, wanted real darkness, and without it, my mind wandered. Every tiny sound outside made me freeze. A piece of fabric snapping in the wind, the pop of ice shifting under the soil. I even thought I heard footsteps once, slow crunches through the frozen moss, but when I sat up and held my breath, the sound faded and nothing followed it. Hours must have passed because the air grew colder, sharper, and I had to pull my bag tighter around me. That was when I noticed something odd. The horizon seemed too empty, too level. Out here the land was mostly flat, but there had always been ridges and small mounds breaking it up. Now, staring out from the flap I had left cracked open, I saw a stretch of white-blue emptiness that went on and on. No breaks, no shapes. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and finally realized what it was. Fog. It wasn't rolling in quickly, but it was coming steadily, swallowing the horizon like a tide. A thick, grayish mist creeping across the tundra, covering everything in a layer of blur. I hadn't expected fog out here. In the back of my mind, I knew what it meant. Moisture meeting the cold air, temperature shifts, but knowing didn't make it less unnerving. Within minutes, the ridges I had used to orient myself were gone, eaten by the haze. My world shrank down to a pale ring of ground around the tent, and beyond that was nothing but shifting gray. I told myself it was fine. I was safe inside the tent, I wasn't going anywhere. But then the silence changed. Fog doesn't really make sound, but when it settled around me, everything grew tighter, muted, like I was sealed off. And that was when I heard it again. The crunching. It was faint, almost lost under the blood rushing in my ears. But it was there, something moving across the frozen moss, slow and deliberate. The sound would come, then stop. Come again, then stop. My mind ran through possibilities. A reindeer, though I hadn't seen a single one all day. Maybe a fox, though it sounded heavier. My chest felt tight. The sound was too close now. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. The fog had thickened so much I couldn't see more than 20 feet. My breath hung in front of me, and I strained my eyes, trying to pick out any shape, any shadow. Nothing, just pale mist curling over the land. And then, the crunch again, louder this time, but in the opposite direction, as if whatever it was had circled me. I ducked back inside and zipped the tent fully shut, heart pounding so loud it felt like the fabric would vibrate with it. I held still, barely breathing, listening. The sound would fade, then return, sometimes on one side, sometimes the other. I realized that if something really was moving out there, it had me surrounded. The hours stretched endlessly. My watch said it was after 3 in the morning, but the light hadn't changed. My body begged for rest, but there was no way I could sleep. At one point, the steps came so close I swore they were just feet from the tent wall. I gripped the handle of my small hatchet, ready to swing if the fabric tore, but nothing happened. Just silence again, so complete it made me doubt my own ears. Eventually, maybe around 5 or 6, the fog began to thin. The ridges reappeared, faint and far. The world opened back up inch by inch, and as it did, the footsteps vanished for good. I sat there until the horizon was clear again, until I could see all the way across the tundra, and there was nothing there. No animal, no tracks, no sign that anything had moved. When I finally crawled out of the tent, the ground was bare and still. I walked slow circles around my campsite, scanning the moss, and found nothing but my own boot prints. No depressões, no scat, no fur. Just untouched tundra. That somehow made it worse. If I had seen reindeer tracks or even fox prints, I could have told myself it was just wildlife. But there was nothing. By the time I packed up camp, the silence felt heavier than ever. The Arctic midnight had played tricks on me, or maybe it hadn't. Maybe something had moved around me in the fog and left no sign. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched, that the stillness out there wasn't empty at all, but full of things I couldn't see. When I finally reached the edge of the ridges and looked back, my tent spot was just another patch of endless land, no different from the rest. No proof I had ever been there, no proof anything had happened, just the Arctic, stretching wide and indifferent, holding its silence. And I knew as I turned away that the memory of that night would stay with me forever, not because of what I saw, but because of what I couldn't. The silence of snow is unlike anything else I've ever experienced. I've camped in all kinds of places, forests thick with leaves, deserts that hummed with wind, lockshores alive with frogs and insects. But the snow brings its own atmosphere. It isn't just quiet. It feels like the whole world has been padded, wrapped in layers, and what little sound you make stays too close, heavy, as if the air refuses to carry it away. That silence is beautiful at first, but when you sit in it long enough, it becomes something darker. It presses against your head until it feels unnatural, almost unbearable. That's what I felt on that trip. I went out alone in early winter, thinking it would be a good chance to test myself before the snow grew too deep. The forecast had been clear, no storms, just crisp cold air. I set out early in the morning, following a forest trail that wound through rolling hills and old pines. The snow wasn't thick yet, only about half a foot, just enough to cover the ground evenly, softening the land like a blanket. My boots crunched with each step, and for a while I liked that sound. It was proof I was still moving forward, proof I was still there. By midday, I found a flat spot sheltered by a cluster of fir trees and decided to set up camp. The branches hung low, weighted with frost, and the snow under them was thinner, the needles poking through. I pitched my tent, stomped out a little space for a fire, and sat down with a thermos of hot water. First, everything felt calm. The sun was bright overhead, bouncing off the snow so sharply that I had to squint. My breath rose in steady clouds, and my fingers warmed by the fire. But after a while, I noticed how still it was. No birds, no distant creak of trees, no running water beneath the ice of the creek nearby. It was as if the woods had drawn a curtain across themselves. The longer I sat, the more it sank in. The fire crackled in front of me, but even that seemed dulled, like the sound was trapped in the circle of my camp. I clapped my hands once, hard, and the noise just stopped, like it had nowhere to go. I tried again, snapping my fingers, but it was swallowed instantly. It made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. I thought maybe moving would help, so I strapped on my pack again and decided to explore a little farther. The snow squeaked beneath my boots, but it was the only sound. My own breathing filled my head until I hated hearing it. I walked toward a small ridge I had noticed earlier, thinking maybe I'd get a better view from higher up. Every step made me more aware of the silence pressing around me. Halfway up, I stopped dead. Behind me, faint but clear, came the sound of snow shifting. Slow, deliberate, like something heavy putting weight into each step. I turned fast, scanning the slope I had just climbed, but the woods lay still. My tracks stretched behind me in a neat line. Nothing else. I waited, holding my breath, my ears straining so hard it hurt. For a long minute, there was nothing. Then again, one soft crunch. Could have been anything, a branch shedding snow, maybe. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded like walking. My throat felt dry, and I forced myself to move again. Slower now, every nerve pulled tight. I kept looking back, but the slope stayed empty. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone anymore. When I reached the ridge, I crouched low, peering out across the forest. The trees stretched in every direction, their tops black against the pale sky. The view should have been breathtaking, but I couldn't enjoy it. My focus kept sliding back to the silence. It wasn't natural. The forest is never completely quiet, not even in winter. There should have been the sound of wind shifting through branches, the faint scuttle of something small under the snow, the distant call of a bird. Instead, there was only me, my body refusing to relax, my heart pounding so hard it filled my ears. I decided to head back down. The daylight was already thinning, and the thought of being out there after dark with that feeling gnawed at me. I moved quickly, retracing my own prints. As I descended, I glanced over my shoulder again and froze. There, just at the edge of the trees where my trail curved, was another set of prints. Large, spaced apart, pressed deep into the snow. They weren't there before. They didn't cross mine. They followed them. Something had been walking in my path, shadowing me from behind. My stomach dropped, and a shiver went straight through me. I didn't stay to study them. I hurried down, my steps fast, the snow spraying as I pushed forward. Back at camp, I threw more wood onto the fire and crouched close to it, facing the woods with every muscle tight. My tent sat behind me, flimsy and useless if something truly came close. The firelight cast long shadows that seemed to twitch whenever I shifted. I scanned the snow for more tracks but saw nothing beyond my own. It was worse, somehow, that the trail had stopped where it did, with no clear sign of where those prints had gone. The silence never broke that night, not once. I didn't hear the snap of a branch, the rustle of movement, or even the sigh of wind. I sat awake, the fire burning low, the cold creeping into my bones, waiting for something to happen. My eyes burned with tiredness, but I didn't dare close them. When morning finally came, the sun weak and pale through the trees, I stepped out into the snow again. My tracks were still there, leading away from camp. The other prints were gone. No sign of them at all. The surface of the snow looked untouched, smooth and clean, like it had covered itself overnight. I knew what I had seen, though. The memory of those deep steps pressed into the snow, following mine exactly, wouldn't leave me. I packed quickly, barely eating, my hands stiff as I pulled down my tent. The silence clung even as I hiked out, mile after mile. Only when I neared the trailhead, the road visible through the trees, did the world seem to return. A crow called overhead. Wind shifted the branches. Distant traffic hummed faintly. The sounds felt almost overwhelming after the suffocating stillness of the woods. Even now, I think about that night, about the silence and those prints. People talk about how peaceful the snow is, how beautiful it makes the world look. And it is, but there's another side to it. The silence of snow can strip everything away until you're left with nothing but yourself, your fear, and the knowledge that something might be out there, moving slowly, waiting. That's the part that lingers. Not the beauty, not the calm, the silence, the kind that feels less like peace and more like a warning. I've always thought of camping as something peaceful, a way to step away from the noise of towns and streets, to let the silence of the forest settle over me. I liked hiking into places that weren't marked by too many boots, where I could pitch a tent and feel like I had the world to myself. That trip, though, turned into something different, and the memory of it has stayed sharp ever since. It wasn't the weather, it wasn't the terrain, and it wasn't even my gear, it was the tracks. I had set out in late fall, one of those weeks where the days were short and the air had a bite to it, but there wasn't much snow yet. The ground was covered in a thin crust of frost in the mornings, and patches of old snow lingered in the shaded parts of the woods. I had my pack loaded down heavier than I should have, but I didn't mind. Moving slowly gave me more time to notice the forest around me. The trail wound through ridges and valleys, spruce trees stacked close together, their needles dull with the season. On my second day out, I decided to explore a little farther from camp. I left my tent pitched by a frozen creek and followed a game trail that twisted through the brush. It felt like one of those days where the forest held its breath. No wind, no rustling of branches. Even the birds seemed absent. My boots crunched against the frost, each step carrying in the quiet like a snap of a twig. I noticed then how soft the ground was in some places, mud frozen shallow but broken by animal prints. Deer mostly, and the occasional rabbit. I walked for what felt like an hour, then stopped to take a drink of water. That's when I noticed it. My own footprints in the thin crust of snow ahead of me, the same ones I had made coming up the trail, except now something else pressed into them. At first, I thought I was seeing it wrong, that maybe the ice had melted strangely in the daylight, but the shape was too clear. Large, round impressions inside my steps, the pads of a big cat. I crouched down, set my glove beside one, and it nearly spanned the width of my palm. Cougar. The realization hit hard, leaving a cold weight in my stomach. I knew they were around these parts, though sightings were rare. What unsettled me was how its prints overlapped mine, step for step, like it had followed me from behind, matching my stride. I looked back down the trail, scanning the trees, but nothing moved. The woods stood silent, branches stiff against the pale sky. I followed the prints a little farther, uneasy but curious. They stayed locked on top of mine for a stretch, then broke off suddenly into the brush. I stopped dead when I saw it. The paw marks veered sideways into the trees, and then they just ended. No more tracks, no more sign of weight pressing into the snow. Just gone. The silence in that moment pressed against my ears. I snapped my fingers once, almost without thinking, expecting the sound to bounce faintly back off the trees. Nothing. The noise was swallowed instantly, like I was standing in a padded room instead of a forest. My breath fogged in the cold air, too loud, and I turned slowly, staring into the dark spaces between the trunks. I knew cougars hunted by stalking, by staying low, by waiting until the moment was right. Everything I had ever read came rushing back, how they followed quietly, how they often stayed just out of sight until they decided to strike. The fact that the tracks stopped didn't mean it was gone. Could mean it had moved onto a log or up into the rocks or higher. My eyes trailed along the branches overhead, the ridge of boulders to the side of the trail. Nothing but stillness. I told myself not to panic. I slid my pack tighter against my shoulders and turned back the way I came, retracing my steps with care. Every so often, I stopped and listened, but the silence was so complete it played tricks on me. My own pulse thudded in my ears like footsteps. The weight of being watched pressed against the back of my neck, and I couldn't shake it. When I made it back to camp, the creak seemed louder than it should have, the brittle sound of ice cracking under the faint current. I built up my fire higher than usual, stacking wood until the flames licked tall and the smoke twisted thick into the air. I sat with my back to a log, forcing myself to face the tree line instead of turning away. Every shadow looked like it could hold a shape. Every cluster of branches seemed ready to shift. I didn't sleep much that night. The fire burned low, and I kept waking, convinced I'd heard something outside the circle of light. But there were no footfalls, no growl, no cry in the distance, only the silence. That was almost worse than noise. In the morning, I checked the snow around my camp. My tracks from the day before were there, but nothing else. No paw prints, no signs of anything moving close while I slept. The forest had erased itself clean overnight, as if it wanted no evidence left. I packed quickly, my fingers stiff with the cold and the nerves still running through me. The hike back out felt longer than it should have. I kept turning, scanning behind me, half expecting to see those tracks lining up with mine again. But I didn't. The ground stayed empty, just the sound of my own boots crunching frost and the creak of my pack straps. Even now, I think about it. Not the silence itself, not even the fact that the cougar was out there. What sticks with me is how it had followed me so perfectly, close enough to shadow my steps, and then vanished into the trees without leaving a trace. It reminded me of how small I was in those woods, how quickly things could tilt from calm to dangerous without warning. When people talk about predators, they think of the attack, the roar, the claws, the blood. But the real fear isn't in the strike. It's in the quiet, in the weight of knowing something is there, watching, deciding, and you may never see it until it's already too late. That day, I walked out of the forest untouched, but not unchanged. I carry that silence with me, and I know I always will. Winter camping had always been something I enjoyed because it cut away all the noise of the busy months. Most people avoided it, which meant the trails were empty, the woods were still, and the world felt untouched. That solitude was part of the draw. But after one trip, deep in the snowbound forest, I realized there was a difference between solitude and being alone with something you couldn't see. It was mid-February, northern woods, the kind of cold that doesn't just sting. It settles into your bones and makes you move slower, makes you careful. I had hiked out during the day, pushing through knee-deep snow along a trail that hadn't been touched in weeks. The sky had been pale gray all afternoon, with clouds thick enough to smother the sun. By the time I found a clearing to set up camp, the world was already dim, and I knew I had only an hour of usable light left. I packed down a flat area with my boots, pitched my tent, and gathered what little dry wood I could find under the fir trees. The silence of winter woods always struck me, the way snow absorbs sound, muffling everything. I could hear my own movements, the crunch of snow underfoot, the zip of my pack, the rasp of my breath in the cold air. Beyond that, nothing. Not a bird, not a branch snapping, just the stillness of frozen forest. When night came, the temperature dropped fast. The fire threw off some heat, but every part of me outside my layers felt raw. I ate quickly, packed away my food, and sat staring at the flames until my eyes watered. Snow pressed in around the edges of the clearing, glowing faintly in the moonlight, and the trees stood dark and heavy. It was the kind of night where you feel like you're the last person in the world. At first, I thought that was true, but after a while, I noticed something. Somewhere behind me, far enough to be out of sight but close enough to hear, something was moving. Slow, deliberate crunches in the snow, spaced apart like the steps of a careful walker. Not quick, not erratic, steady, dragging slightly with each sound. I froze, straining to listen. 50 meters, maybe less. That was where it seemed to be. I turned my head slowly, staring into the line of trees, but there was nothing, just black trunks and the pale surface of the snow. My breath made thin clouds in the air, loud against the stillness, and I almost held it back to hear better. Crunch, pause, crunch. My heartbeat spiked. My first thought was moose, but moose don't move like that. They're heavy, fast, and when they walk through deep snow, it's more chaotic, a thundering kind of noise. This wasn't like that. It was patient, intentional. I stood up, brushing snow off my pants, and snapped my fingers, sharp in the cold air. I expected the sound to bounce off the trees, to come back faint but present. Didn't. It vanished into the night like I hadn't made it at all. That's when my stomach dropped. Something was wrong. The crunching stopped the moment I made the sound. The forest went still again, too still. I waited, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the tree line. Minutes passed, my legs beginning to ache from standing so rigid. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had imagined it, the steps started again. Slow, closer. I backed toward the fire, gripping the knife I always kept on my belt. The heat on my back was small comfort compared to the darkness pressing in from every direction. My mind raced through possibilities. Wolf? Bear out of hibernation? Another person? None of them made sense. Wolves don't walk alone like that, not with such heavy, spaced-out steps. Bears don't move silently between steps. And if it was a person, why stay just out of sight? I forced myself to call it nerves. The woods play tricks in winter. Sound carries strangely in snow. Distances stretch and compress. I told myself that, but it didn't matter. Every instinct screamed that something was pacing me from the trees. Hours passed with me sitting by the fire, listening, waiting. The steps came and went, sometimes closer, sometimes fading until I thought they were gone, only to return again. I never saw anything move between the trees. Not a shadow, not a flicker, just sound, deliberate and steady. When the fire burned low, I fed it, refusing to let the light shrink. My eyes burned from watching the dark too long, every branch and shadow morphing into something else. The silence between the steps was worse than the sound itself. At least when it moved, I knew it was still out there. When it stopped, the waiting was unbearable. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me down. My body felt heavy, my eyelids raw. I knew I couldn't stay up forever. I packed myself into the tent, knife still in hand, and lay listening. First, there was nothing, just the fabric of the tent shifting with my movements, the sound of my breath in the sleeping bag. Then crunch. Closer this time, maybe 20 meters. I gripped the knife so tight my hand hurt. The steps circled slowly, never rushing, never retreating. They stopped, then came again, always just far enough away that I couldn't see anything if I dared to unzip the tent. I stayed frozen, every nerve alive, until at some point I must have slipped into a shallow, restless sleep. When I woke, the gray light of dawn had crept into the sky. My body was stiff, my throat dry, my nerves frayed. I crawled out of the tent, blinking in the weak light, scanning the clearing. The snow was undisturbed near my camp, no tracks but my own. I thought for a moment I had gone crazy, that it had all been in my head. Then I saw them, just beyond the edge of the trees, circling in a wide ring around my clearing, were deep impressions in the snow. Not animal tracks, not boot prints, something broad, uneven, dragging slightly with each step. The line of them circled once, then cut off as if whatever made them had slipped back deeper into the woods. I didn't waste time. I tore down camp with shaking hands, stuffed everything into my pack haphazardly, and started back toward the trail. My breath steamed hard in the cold air, every step faster than the last. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to rest. I just pushed until the sound of distant roads and the sight of my car finally broke the grip the forest had on me. I never figured out what was in those trees. Maybe a person, though that idea unsettles me more than any animal explanation. Whoever they were, they had no reason to stalk me in silence, no reason to stay just out of sight. If it wasn't a person, then it was something I couldn't name, something that walked in slow, deliberate steps behind me all night long. What I do know is that I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps, steady, patient, dragging through the snow, always just behind me, always close enough to hear but never close enough to see. That was the last time I camped alone in the winter. The woods are still beautiful, still draw me in, but now the silence feels different. When I hear it, I remember that night, and I can almost feel those steps circling me again, waiting just beyond the trees. I had always thought silence in the woods was supposed to be calming. That's what most people imagine. Peace, quiet, the absence of cars and phones and everything else that keeps your head buzzing. But the truth is, silence in the wrong place at the wrong time is one of the most unnerving things a person can ever feel. I learned that firsthand 2 years ago, and the memory still makes my skin crawl. It wasn't even a camping trip, not at first. I was home, in a quiet town, on a warm morning in August. The air had that heavy summer feel to it. Humid but not suffocating, bright blue sky overhead, a few wisps of clouds. It was one of those days where everything feels normal, where nothing bad should ever happen. I carried a bag of trash out to the bins near the edge of the yard, half awake, thinking more about coffee than anything else. The moment I stepped outside, it hit me. Silence, not just quiet, the kind of silence that swallows you whole. The air was still, no breeze pushing through the trees, no birds singing, no insects buzzing. Even in the middle of the night in my town, you can usually hear something. A dog bark in the distance, a car on the highway, maybe the faint hum of cicadas. But this was different. It was like the world had been turned off. At first, I thought maybe I was just imagining it. I shifted the bag in my hands, and I heard the crinkle of the plastic. But even that sounded wrong, dull, muted, like the sound wasn't carrying properly. My footsteps on the pavement seemed to fall flat, as though the air had thickened and was smothering the noise. I froze for a second, standing there with a bag of garbage in my hand, listening hard. Nothing. No rustle of leaves, no chirp of a sparrow, no fly buzzing past my ear. The silence was so complete it made my chest feel tight. It wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, unnatural. I dumped the bag into the bin and just stood there, scanning the yard. The trees at the edge of the property stood perfectly still, not a branch moving. The grass seemed stiff and unmoving, as if even the tiniest breath of wind had vanished. It was like stepping into a photograph, where everything looked real but nothing moved. The strangest part was the way my own sounds didn't fit. I shuffled my feet in the gravel, and it was as if I was stomping in a padded room. I cleared my throat, and the noise was short, cut off, swallowed almost before I finished making it. It was so unnatural that I had the sudden, insane thought that maybe I had gone deaf. But I could still hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat in my ears. It was the world around me that had gone dead. I stayed out there longer than I should have, partly out of confusion, partly because I didn't know what else to do. I checked the street in front of the house. Empty, no cars, no joggers, no distant hum of engines. The longer I stood, the heavier the air felt, like it was pressing against me. Minutes passed. It's hard to describe how long that silence stretched, but it was enough for me to notice how uneasy I had become. My skin prickled like I was being watched. The stillness had a weight to it, the kind that makes your instincts scream that something is wrong. And then, without warning, the world came back. It didn't ease in, didn't slowly build. It was instant, like a switch flipped. 1 second the silence was crushing me, the next it was gone. Car rumbled down the street. Birds erupted in song, dozens of them filling the air at once. Leaves shook in a breeze I hadn't felt moments earlier. A dog barked from 3 houses down. Cicadas buzzed, loud and shrill. The explosion of noise was almost worse than the silence. It startled me so badly I stumbled back, my heart hammering. I felt dizzy, disoriented, like I had stepped through a doorway into another world and then been shoved back into my own. I stood there in the driveway, staring at the trees swaying in the wind that had suddenly returned, listening to the endless hum of life that had been absent just moments before. I went back inside, shaken, trying to process what had just happened. Everything indoors sounded normal. My footsteps on the floor, the faucet running, the clatter of a spoon against a mug. But the moment I glanced back out the window, I half expected the silence to return, like it was waiting for me. For the rest of that day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying it in my head. 10 minutes, maybe more, where the outside world had gone dead. I thought about weather, about air pressure shifts, about some strange trick of my ears. But none of it fit. The sound hadn't faded in and out. It had just stopped, completely unnaturally, like someone had muted the world. That night, lying in bed, I started to think about all the times I'd been in the woods camping, when things had gone eerily quiet. I remembered nights where the crickets stopped all at once, when the owls went silent, when even the trees seemed to hold their breath. I had always told myself it was because of a predator nearby, a coyote, a bear, something that made the smaller creatures go still. But what I experienced that morning wasn't like that. This wasn't selective silence. This was total. Everything gone, even the wind itself. What really unsettled me was how it ended. Not slowly, not naturally, but like the world hit an unpause button. The sound slammed back so hard it hurt my ears, like it was making up for the time it had been gone. That was the part one couldn't explain away with nature or coincidence. I never told anyone about it in detail. How do you explain that the world just stopped? People would shrug, say I was exaggerating, or that I was half asleep and misremembering. But I know what I felt. I know the suffocating weight of that silence, and I know how it felt when it broke. Ever since, I haven't looked at silence the same way. Camping trips feel different now. When the woods go still at night, my body tenses, waiting for that dead air to fall again. Sometimes I lie awake in my tent, holding my breath, half convinced it's about to happen. That morning changed the way I listened to the world. I realized how fragile the constant hum of life really is, how much we depend on those tiny noises to feel safe. When they're gone, even for a short time, you understand just how thin the line is between normal and terrifying. It's been 2 years, and I still think about it. I don't know what caused it, and I doubt I ever will. But I know one thing for certain. Silence like that isn't natural. It's not peaceful. It's not calm. It's a reminder that the world we take for granted can change in an instant. And when it does, you're left with nothing but your own heartbeat and the realization that you're not in control of anything. That silence never left me. It waits in the back of my mind, and every time the air stills, every time the birds cut off their song all at once, I feel it again, that moment when the world died, and I was left standing there alone with nothing. The trip started the way most of my solo trips did. I drove north out of town, past the small gas stations and diners, until the roads narrowed and the trees closed in around them. It was mid-October, that stretch of the year where the leaves had mostly fallen, and the bare branches clawed at the sky. The air was already sharp enough to bite my lungs when I stepped out of the car at the trailhead. I had packed heavy for the cold, extra layers, a thick sleeping bag, food for 5 days. I thought I'd have nothing to worry about but the weather. I hiked in about 8 miles the first day, far enough to get away from any chance of running into other people. That's what I usually wanted. The quiet, the feeling that the whole forest belonged to me. But this time, that quiet felt heavier than usual. By the time I found a flat spot near a ridge to pitch my tent, the sun was slipping behind the trees and the forest was already darker than it should have been. I got a small fire going, made a quick meal, and tried to settle in. The first strange thing happened while I was lying in my tent, half asleep. I thought I heard movement outside, slow, dragging steps, like something heavy was being pulled through the leaves. I held still, listening, my heartbeat thudding in my chest. The sound would come, then stop, then start again. At first I told myself it was a deer, maybe an elk, something natural. But there was a pattern to it, a slowness that didn't match an animal. Eventually it faded, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning I shook it off. I boiled water, made coffee, and hiked a few miles deeper into the woods with just my pack. The forest was stripped bare of birds, of insects, of sound. The only noise was the crunch of my boots on frozen leaves. I told myself I liked it, that the solitude was why I came. But in the back of my head, I felt something off. That night, it came back. The steps. This time, I sat up in my tent, knife in hand, straining to hear. They circled slowly, too far to be right outside, but close enough that I could feel the presence of something moving around me. Every few minutes, they would stop, then start again. It went on for hours. I didn't sleep at all. By the third day, I was jumpy. Every sound made me turn. My food didn't taste right, and I found myself staring at the tree line for long stretches, waiting for something to appear. I remembered the old stories about the Wendigo, about men who went mad in the woods, starving and cold, imagining monsters stalking them. I tried to laugh at myself, but it didn't help. The word stuck in my head. The Wendigo was out. That night, I built my fire larger, hoping the light would push back whatever was there. Didn't. I woke up after dozing off in my chair. The fire burned low, and I felt it then, the clear sense of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, and for a moment I thought I saw something tall between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. The steps returned, closer this time. Crunch, pause. Crunch, pause. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The sound circled again, deliberate, as if it knew exactly where I was. Then, faintly, I caught something else. Not breathing, not an animal's snort or huff, but something dry, a rasp, almost like a throat trying to clear but too empty to do it. I didn't move until daylight. On the fourth morning, I decided to cut the trip short. I packed fast, my hands clumsy from lack of sleep, nerves raw. As I was rolling my tent, I noticed something in the dirt just beyond the fire ring. A footprint, bare, long and wide, pressed into the frozen ground. My stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal print. It wasn't a boot. It was a human foot, but wrong, stretched thin, with toes too long. That was when I stopped pretending I was imagining things. I threw my gear together and started back down the trail, moving as fast as I could. The woods felt different now, every tree hiding something, every shadow shifting. After a couple miles, I started hearing it again. Not behind me, not ahead, but off to the side, always at the edge of my vision. The same dragging steps pacing me. No matter how fast I walked, it kept pace. I refused to look directly at it, but I felt it there. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I stopped once to catch my breath, leaning on a tree, and that was when I smelled it. A stench, heavy and rotting, like meat left too long in the sun. It rolled through the trees, so strong I gagged. I turned my head, and in that split second, I saw it. A figure, tall and skeletal, standing between the trunks. Its skin clung to bone, its head too long, its arms dangling unnaturally. It didn't move. It just stood there. My blood went cold. I blinked, and it was gone, but the smell lingered. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran, my pack slamming into my shoulders, my lungs burning. The forest blurred around me, every sound a threat. I didn't stop until I burst out onto the trailhead where my car was parked. My legs nearly gave out as I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I sat there for a long time, gasping for air, watching the tree line. Nothing came out. The woods stood silent, empty, but I couldn't shake the certainty that something had followed me all the way back. Driving away, I realized I couldn't tell anyone exactly what I saw. They'd call it exhaustion, nerves, and overactive imagination. Maybe they'd be right, but I know what I smelled. I know what I heard circling my camp night after night, and I know what I saw standing in those trees, even if it was only for a second. People say the Wendigo is a story, a piece of folklore. I think they're wrong. I think the story came from something real, something human once, twisted by hunger, cold, and madness until it became unrecognizable. I don't believe in monsters anymore, but I believe in desperation, in people breaking out there in the endless silence of the woods. The Wendigo was out, and I was close enough to know it wasn't just a story.